and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for the continued support. I really appreciate it. Up to 71 subscribers at the last count, with plenty of views as well. Over 500 on the last transfer update. So here I am bringing another one with a little bit more news. Reaffirmed interest pretty much in Kieran Tierney. Is a name that I mentioned in last week's video, but also has been named across the summer. It was an early target for Newcastle. It's not really news that Newcastle are chasing Kieran Tierney, but the context is quite significant given that they are still chasing another player, possibly two if they can, but they're sort of very aware of the budget constraints back with that FFP situation. So in this video I'm just going to discuss the situation with Kieran Tierney, the situation with Mark Cucurella as well, who's another name linked with that left back berth at Newcastle from Chelsea, and also the current situation with centre backs. As I mentioned last week, I still believe that that's where the priority lies, with Fabian Schär struggling with injury over the last few weeks. Obviously did play against Aston Villa at the weekend, but that sort of gap in quality between him and Lascelles will be sort of tested this season. Obviously there's a lack of pace there as well, which is crucial, but also I think Fabian Schär, a bit similar with the Kieran Trippier and Tino Livramento situation, there's a sort of understanding that there needs to be a long-term solution to him, to his situation, because he's 31 and he's not getting any younger, and he's quite often a bit of an injury doubt. So there is a sort of thought process around the centre-back situation where that takes precedence, but that doesn't mean that they're not looking at the left-back situation. As I did mention last week, that Tierney's name is continuously still being mentioned. It was mentioned right at the start of the summer. There were apparently talks, tentative talks now. I've said on the True Faith podcast before, the difference in terms of when we discuss talks, it can mean anything from talks over a fee, talks over a contract, talks over, it can mean anything from tentative to final talks. So the word talks doesn't really mean anything. There were discussions over a potential deal earlier in the summer. 25 to 30 million was the price that Newcastle were apparently quoted, and they sort of turned their noses up at that. What they'll be looking for is a loan with an obligation to buy, I'm imagining. I think that's kind of the situation where they will be with most of the targets on this list, and there's a reality check for them that's going to be quite difficult for them to swing. So I think really it's going to be an interesting one to watch this play out over the next couple of weeks, whether they go for a left back, whether they go for a centre back. Tierney is their number one target at left back, was right at the start of the summer. Really fits the bill in terms of, he's very similar in the sense that he can, like Livramento and like Trippier, in that he can defend and attack in equal measure. He can play as back three, play centrally in a back three for Scotland, because obviously Andy Robertson plays left back there. But he can really sort of create that balance in at left back, which Newcastle have lacked when Dan Burns there. Obviously Dan Burns is a centre back by trade, 6'7". He's not going to be making marauding runs forward, whereas Tierney can do that. The biggest problem with Tierney is his fitness, but the sense around him is that he could be available this summer again, and more available now than he was in perhaps June, because Mikel Arteta really doesn't fancy him. He's quite clearly not in the plans there. But Jurrien Timber's just got an injury, a quite serious knee injury, so that might play into the thinking. Real Sociedad are linked as well. Celtic have been linked with a move back to get him back from obviously where he came from. He started his career there. He's obviously a Celtic fan as well. So I think it'll be quite difficult for Newcastle to swing this one, because I don't think Arsenal are going to be particularly fond of signing a player, of selling a player, or loaning a player to a team that might very well be quite close to them in the table. That's something to consider. And again, even though he's available, I did sort of have a conversation with someone today where the conversation sort of turned into, the fee would need to be quite heavy, or there would need to be some sort of incentive for Arsenal to do it. And I think with an obligation to buy, that's one thing, but Newcastle are not going to put down a lot of money on this deal, so it's going to be one that's going to be interesting to watch. And I think that's kind of the same for Cucurella as well. It's another name that was linked a little bit later in the window, who I was made aware of a couple of months ago, but I don't really see this one as quite as good a fit. I think Chelsea are about to loan Lewis Hall out to Crystal Palace. Martson might go out on loan as well. There's Ben Chilwell, obviously started at the weekend, and he's obviously going to be first choice for Mauricio Pochettino. Cucurella is less defensively solid. I think that's quite crucial. He is more of a wing back. He played in the back five, where he's really successful for Brighton. Obviously, he's very highly rated. I think a lot of context needs to be given around these players, and particularly Cucurella, because a year ago, if Newcastle had pounced on him and signed him, it would have been an excellent deal. But now it's sort of viewed as a little bit tainted by a difficult year that he's had at Chelsea. But I think, you've got to take into consideration that nobody had a good year at Chelsea last year. It was a really poor fit for him there. It didn't make sense. He was linked with Manchester City all of last summer, and then at the last minute Chelsea just pounced and spent 63 million on him, and he moved there, and there was no obvious fit for him even when Graham Potter went there, who's old manager at Brighton. So I think that this move would perhaps, with a little bit more forethought, would make sense going forward. He would obviously create he would bring that creativity and bring that width and that other outlet in attack. But I think, again, defensively he's a bit more suspect. And the thing that Eddie Howe really likes about Dan Burn is that defensive solidity. If you're going to usurp Dan Burn, you need to be good defensively as well as bringing the obviously attacking flair that he perhaps lacks. And also, just a quick update on the centre-back situation. Jean-Claire Todibo is a name to watch. There's a few names have been linked in the last week. An interesting one is Edmund Tapsoba, who was linked with Tottenham until they got Mickey van der Ven from Wolfsburg. And Manchester United have been sniffing around him and Todibo all summer. But I think, depending on what happens with Harry Maguire, that deal has to go through before Manchester United come to the table for anybody. So if Newcastle do want to act on a centre-back, now's the time in that sense. He's 6'4", really impressive, powerful centre-back, 24 years old, I think. Really impressive player. Obviously plays for Bayer Leverkusen, who Newcastle have struggled to negotiate with in the past over Moussa Diaby. They're not going to commit to a deal, whether it's for a left-back or a centre-back, with a huge fee and a huge upfront fee, which is what clubs will need at this late stage in the window to negotiate. In terms of outgoings, there's a lot of talk of Ryan Fraser going to Celtic this summer. He's obviously cut out at Newcastle, training with the under-23s, which a lot of the surplus players are. Jeff Hendrick and Isaac Hayden as well are both in with the reserves, and I think that this one is an interesting one. Obviously, he's not played since that sort of acrimonious split between him and Eddie Howe back in February, just before the cup final. He was linked with Southampton over the initial talks with Tino Livramento. That didn't materialise. His wages, and the same with Isaac Hayden and Jeff Hendrick, are going to be a problem for anybody, because their Premier League wages, he's on about £70,000 a week, I believe. The key thing for anyone buying Ryan Fraser is that they're going to have to find some sort of compromise with Newcastle and with the player himself to sort of lure him away from that contract he's got at St James's Park. The same with Isaac Hayden. I think he's on about 50,000, and the same with Jeff Hendrick, which is just not feasible money for Championship teams which are pretty much his level. Their level. That's where you would expect those players to go. So there was a rumor that that Rafa Benitez was interested in taking him to Celta Vigo, which obviously made sense because he brought him to Newcastle. That up on the Spanish side, and it was kind of denied and pushed away. So it's interesting to see if that one comes back. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's not too much going on with Isaac Hayden and Jeff Hendrick. It'd be interesting to see if Celtic can clinch this deal for Ryan Fraser. I believe that interest is genuine. That is a deal that could happen, but again, you would have to find a possibility for the wages situation, because I don't think Celtic can afford what Fraser's on at Newcastle, which is currently around £70,000 a week, as I said. One final update from me, and that's on Martin Dubravka. I think this will be an interesting one. I don't think Newcastle don't want to lose him. Obviously, he's a very capable second choice to Nick Pope, but he doesn't particularly want to be a number two either. Last summer, obviously, you got that move to Manchester United, which was really pushed for from his side. It wasn't Newcastle weren't interested initially in letting him go, and it was Eddie Howe kind of has to be talked into it. Since he's come back, he's not really kicked up a fuss. He's played a few games, he's played in the cups, and he's played a couple of times in pre-season and impressed. Everyone knows how good Martin Dubravka is, but I think that this is one that, if an offer comes in and Newcastle find it acceptable, then he might well go, because he's somebody who doesn't want to be sat on the bench. We'll see where Martin Dubravka is playing his football. I'm not 100% certain it'll be at Newcastle. I think there's an interesting twist there to come, and obviously plenty of admiring glances have been made over towards in his direction. But I wonder if Newcastle might relent and let him go, given that I know they've already let Carl Darlow go, but they've got Loris Karius in there, who obviously has really impressed within the club since he's arrived, and obviously made that really sort of didn't do anything wrong in the cup final, and I think that sort of changed a lot of perception about him. So I wonder if Martin Dubravka will leave, but I don't think anything is imminent on that one. Thank you once again for joining me. I think I'm getting into the swing of these YouTube videos now. I'm really enjoying producing the content, really enjoying getting in front of the camera and giving my thoughts on Newcastle United and football in general. So keep following, keep liking, subscribing. Really appreciate the support so far, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.